studio. I was raped, and we need to talk about it. That is the headline of a column online at the Huffington Post. Google the headline, go to Huffington Post. You can find it there. Or go to the Twitter account of our next guest, Jean-Paul Bedard. He tweets at Run, JP, Run. Jean-Paul, thanks very much for joining me in studio today.
Thank you, Anthony. It's a pleasure to be here.
I want to read a couple lines from your column. As a boy and later as a young man, I was taught to bury my feelings and to embrace everything that being a man afforded me. Further, as a gifted athlete, I was granted entry into that inner sanctum of testosterone-fueled manhood known as the sports world. Unlike today, inclusiveness, fair play, and empathy were certainly not the buzzwords of our generation. And you continue, but what the other young men in the locker room didn't know was that hidden within plain sight was an interloper in their midst. You see, 2 years before I entered high school, I was the victim of a violent rape that took place a mere few kilometers from the football locker room I was now standing in. And JP, in that column and in other pieces you've written, you say how this event has gone on to cause significant trauma for you in your life. You're struggling with it. There's stuff you're doing that we're going to talk about to really fight back and achieve a personal best. Tell us your story.
Well, I grew up in North Toronto and was a pretty, normal upbringing. I played sports. I was quite gifted at hockey, so I moved up fairly quickly throughout the ranks. And when I was 9 years old, I was sexually abused by a hockey coach. And I told my dad the night after it happened, and he went and dealt with it right away. But didn't really have any resolution of that incident throughout the rest of my childhood. And then about 3 years later, I was 12 years old, and I had stolen cigarettes from my father and had gone into a ravine in North Toronto after school to smoke the cigarettes. And I was approached by two young men, and it quickly turned into a violent sexual assault. And when they left, I was lying on the ground in the mud. And I never told anybody what happened to me that day until about 35 years later.
Wow. So none of your assaulters have seen justice?
The hockey coaches were in the process of dealing with that right now in the court system. But no, the other two gentlemen, there's been no recourse with that. But the issue with sexual assault is that it's, people jokingly refer to it as it's a gift that keeps giving. And that's sort of what happened throughout my life. I quickly left sports at the age of 15, became heavily involved in drugs and alcohol, and suffered through really serious problems with addiction throughout most of my life. And the addiction dovetailed nicely into problems with depression, a diagnosis of manic depression, and there were a couple of suicide attempts. Basically, my life was completely off the rails. And then at about, in my mid-30s, I guess, I decided I needed to get some help for my addiction. So I entered a treatment program, and while I was in that treatment program, I met two other men who were training for a marathon, and they asked me if I would be interested in training with them. And I had always been a little bit of a runner, nothing serious, not competitive in any way. But over the course of the next 6 months, I would meet these gentlemen every Sunday for a long run, and we complained bitterly every week when we got together for our run. And it wasn't usually about, how hard it is running, but it was usually about how no one understands us as recovering addicts. But, it taught me to commit to something and to follow through with a plan and to have people to depend on me. And in that, I learned to depend on myself. And we trained for the Toronto Waterfront Marathon, and in that first marathon, I qualified for the Boston Marathon. I did really well.
Wow, great.
And it just changed my life. And I kind of had a lot of success in running over the years, but then about just over 2.5 years ago, I needed to deal with this issue of the sexual abuse from my past that I had not dealt with at all. I sat my wife down. I'd been married for about 27 years at the time, and my adult son. And I explained to them.
You'd never told them about this?
My wife knew about the hockey coach, but not the rape in the ravine. And I sat down with them and explained, what had happened to me and that I really needed help. I just felt like I just couldn't do it anymore. I felt like I was keeping all these balls in the air, and I was terrified that I was going to start drinking or using again.
You've mentioned in one column thoughts of suicide.
Yes, there were a couple of incidents with that, and depression is something that I've struggled with throughout my life, and certainly running and exercise has been an incredible outlet to help me work through a lot of those issues. So after this conversation with my wife and son, we did exactly what we were supposed to do. We contacted our doctor, and I got some help and got enrolled into a treatment program that deals with adult survivors. And that was about 2 weeks before the Boston Marathon. And because I'd already committed to going down to run the marathon, my wife came down to Boston with me, and I ran the marathon, and it was just, it was a horrible day for me. I was just an emotional wreck, taken off the course at one point because I was hyperventilating from crying, and managed to finish the race. But it wasn't meant to be, I guess, because that was the day of the bombings. And I had finished the marathon and had a quick shower, and my wife and I went back out on the streets to grab a bite to eat, and we were there for the explosions. And so I think the PTSD from what I experienced in Boston, combined with dealing with the sexual assaults, it significantly changed my life, and it put me into a new direction.
You are now doing something on October 18th that I've never really heard of before. I know a number of people who have run in the Toronto Waterfront Marathon, but I haven't heard many people who have started it at midnight the night before, run it once, run it twice, and then at the starting time at 8 or 8:30 a.m., you'll run it a third time.
Yeah, part of my healing process at the treatment program for the sexual abuse, I decided to go back to Boston the following year after the bombings, and I ran the marathon twice in the same day to raise a little bit of money and awareness for this treatment program, the Gatehouse in Toronto, that had helped me. Because I'm so intricately connected to the running scene in Toronto, I also wanted to do something in our city to kind of raise awareness for, the prevalence of sexual violence in our society and how people who come through it are extremely resilient. So I decided to run the Toronto Waterfront Marathon on October 18th this year 3 times. So that's right, I'll be going out around midnight the night before, and I'll run 42.2 kilometers, and then I'll run 42.2 kilometers again, and I'll time it so that I've finished the second marathon at the beginning of the official marathon, and then I'll run it with everybody else. So that'll bring into a total of 126.6 kilometers. It's a long way. And every step of that way, I'll have all of those survivors of sexual assault who are giving me huge support.
Now, I want to start talking to you about the issues. Sometimes I definitely feel like the phrase raise awareness is overused, used too much. But I feel like in the context of male victims and survivors of sexual assault, we don't have that conversation a lot. We've definitely been talking in society a lot about sexual assault. It's usually been women. Do you find there's still, it seems to me that we just rarely hear a story like yours coming forward? Is it because of the far fewer numbers out there, or the fact that men just, I mean, let's be honest, a guy doesn't want to go on a major radio show and say I was raped for a number of societal reasons that should be obvious.
Yes, I completely agree with all those statements. There have been a few sort of high-profile males who have come forward, Theo Fleury and the Jays pitcher Dickey, who have come forward talking about the sexual abuse in their past. Listen, the statistics in Canada are alarming. It's something like 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 boys who are...
the boys' number is that high?
It's that high.
Because we hear the girls' number all the time.
Yeah, the boys' number is that high.
Wow.
So, you figure every time you get on a busy streetcar in Toronto or a subway train, there's probably 6 or 7 people on that car who are survivors of sexual assault. It's an alarming number, and it's often said that hurt people, and that's what I feel is one of the passions behind me deciding to come forward. I mean, I know that after the sexual abuse in my past, my behavior hurt a lot of people, not sexually, but it's just...
You felt angry,
I felt angry,
violent.
I didn't trust people, I had addiction problems that I still, suffer from, and depression. And I think the only way to deal with that is to remove some of the stigma around having this discussion.
And we're back with guest Jean-Paul Bedard. He's talking about his Huffington Post piece, I Was Raped, and we need to talk about it, by Jean-Paul Bedard, Huffington Post column. You can find it online. Jean-Paul, before the break, I said to you, I'd like to get specific instances of things that can be done to raise awareness and also to break the stigma, because they're buzz phrases we hear a lot, but I think there's content lying under the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, definitely. In terms of helping to eliminate the stigma, I think having a conversation about this issue is a really difficult thing to do. And I know from my own experience, as soon as you mention, that you were a victim of, or a survivor of, so I should say, a survivor of sexual assault, it has a real capacity to clear a room quickly. People start to get to this defensive, caring mechanism, which is just a natural response for people. And
right.
The first thing they say is, "Oh, I'm so sorry."
Right.
Which is, a normal thing. But as a survivor, I don't want people to feel sorry for me. I just want people just to see that what happened to me is not me. I'm so much more than that, but I need to kind of work through it. And I want to make sure that, the people who are following me, my son and my grandkids or anybody else is not going to be a victim of a similar event.
Do you feel, and people who follow my columns know that I'm a critic of the way that phrases rape culture and so forth are used, mostly because I feel that there's some vagueness going on there. And when you say, and I totally get what you're saying, that you want to live a normal life, I do feel like the rape culture conversation, though, doesn't it make it harder because it overemphasizes how we want to talk about people as, and I know they would disagree with me that, the victim words are using, but it's still, I think it still emphasizes the victim capacity.
Definitely, but one of the main things that I'm trying to bring into this conversation is the male voice, and
right.
It's a very difficult position to be in, particularly as a survivor of sexual assault myself, because there is a feeling that by men speaking up in this issue or adding their voice to this issue, that in some way will be taking resources and attention away from female survivors of sexual assault.
Seriously? People have
yeah, there's
men are afraid of that, or people have said that you're doing that?
I've had that experience before.
Wow.
It's not a universal experience, but I have had that. And I have a lot of sort of guilt about that, because that's really not what this is about. It's not about bringing attention on to my experience. It's basically about how can we create an environment where this isn't going to happen. There are simple things that I would recommend. I mean, I have suggested that we bring men into the conversation. And by doing that, we have to say that, men tend to pull away from this conversation because they feel that there is this prejudgment that all men have the capacity to do this. So initially, defenses come up. And I think that that's not a healthy starting point of any conversation.
Are men afraid of being made fun of? Have you been made fun of for having been raped?
I have definitely had people come at me at social media, but that's just the trolls
right.
that are out there. No matter what you're, supporting, that's going to be a natural consequence of it. But all of the things that kept me silent for years, my fear of my shame, my fear of embarrassment, all of those things, none of them came to pass when I eventually did disclose what happened to me. I've just been supported just very wonderfully by the people who are the most important to me in my life.
For people who don't have a strong family system, friend system, support network, what should they do? You give recommendations in your column, things that you want to see happen, and one is people getting the professional support they need to address the consequences of sexual violence in their past.
Yeah, the one thing that you need is to try, if possible, find at least one person who is willing to listen to you. And that can be a friend, it can be family members, but often it's not a family member because there might be a connection to the abuse there. For me...
And you had no one for years. Because you said you didn't tell your wife and child. Did you have other people like in support groups that your wife didn't know about? Or
no,
you were just pure silent?
Completely silent. I mean, I was in support groups for my addiction issues.
Right.
What I would also suggest is that, as we are encouraging people to come forward with their disclosures, and we're starting to see momentum with the Jian Ghomeshi, the Bill Cosby thing, and then the backlash against this U.S. blogger, Roosh V, who was trying to get into town. We have to be cognizant that when we are encouraging people to come forward, we have to have the resources for them available immediately. There's a great clinic in Toronto, the Barbara Schleifer Clinic, who helps women dealing with sexual violence. And I know that they're overwhelmed by the numbers of phone calls they're getting every week. And we have to just be careful that we support these caring professions that are there to help us. Another thing that I'm a big proponent of is responsibility on social media. And I know on my own Facebook feed, there's a lot of inappropriate stuff that comes up there that I would say is, sexually inappropriate. And instead of just ignoring it, I'm actually trying to do things like respond in a comment that's not critical, but at least initiates a conversation. You can always unfriend people, but I think anything that you are silent about, you are promoting.
And you have a number of recommendations in your column, including working to tear away layers of taboo, bringing more men into the conversation, expressing gratitude for overworked frontline support workers. And I'm fully on board with you there, 2 thumbs up. Where my criticism and concern about rape culture comes in is partially what you're saying about the social media. You say actively drawing attention to and speaking out against the prevalence of sexual violence in mainstream media, movies and television. If you consume it, you promote it. I've just finished watching both series of True Detective, and it's classic HBO in which it glamorizes violence, it glamorizes sexuality, and it even partially glamorizes rape, or at least sexual abuse, because there's prostitutes and dead people I think there's been sexual assault involved as well. And I think and I think a lot of people would want to put that in a rape culture narrative, but it's just human nature to like these, Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, that stuff's all happening there. And if someone's saying, man, that True Detective episode was sexy, I mean, I wouldn't want to unfriend them. I personally wouldn't even want to call them out, because I know that they don't have ill will towards anyone, and they're not actually promoting a liberty violation of anyone else. They're just liking these outlandish stories, and that's almost catharsism for us. Do you disagree with me on that?
I'm certainly not a purist in terms of the content that I consume over the years, and I'm not sort of an anti-violent advocate. But what I would say is I'd like to see sort of the full picture in the story. I mean, yeah, we will see prostitution in films and in media, but I'd like to see the story behind that. I mean, I live in a neighborhood that has a very high prevalence of sex workers and people who are engaged in the sex trade. And I've got to know some of these people through talking to them, and they all have a story, right? And it's not just about exploitation of body. There are addictions that lie behind that, mental health issues, abuse in their childhood or in the past, or just economic situations that drive people into that field. So I think I too am uncomfortable with the idea of rape culture, but glorification of it to me feels wrong.
On that note, we got to go. Jean-Paul Bedard, thanks very much for joining us, telling your story. Really interesting stuff. Folks, if you want to read I Was Raped and We Need to Talk About It, you can go to huffingtonpost.ca. You can also find Jean-Paul on Twitter at RunJPRun. Thank you again, sir.
Thank you very much for having me.